Okay, hi. Welcome to the AURES Auction Academy. My name's Oscar Fitzroy. I'm a researcher here at the University of Exeter and part of the AURES consortium. So this particular webinar is part of a series. I don't know if anyone's attended the others. This is webinar number 6. Some of the earlier ones looked at some of the broad issues to do with auctions and participation. This is one of two webinars looking at specific design elements of auctions. This one is specifically looking at pre-qualification rules and penalties. There'll be a follow-up next week looking at active diversity and new business models. Okay, so this is the 6th one. We're looking at something which is very specific to auctions, which are the pre-qualification rules and the penalties that can be designed into them. This morning we're going to talk for around about half an hour, followed by some questions looking at this topic. First of all, I'll introduce pre-qualification criteria and penalties and explain a little bit about what they're for, and then we'll go into look at some of the case study examples that draws from some of the earlier work in the AURES program. And look at 4 different examples of where pre-qualification and penalties are done, and perhaps look at some of the implications of that for the outcomes. And then finally, we'll conclude, and we'll have a look at what conclusions we can draw from that. I should probably warn you at this stage that it's very difficult to draw firm conclusions, and there are no easy answers. And as we'll see as we go through, the context for designing these elements and implementing pre-qualification rules and penalties are extremely context specific. Okay, so, well, what are they? I suppose is the key question to ask. First of all, I'd say pre-qualification criteria, as a definition, are tests that apply to projects or developers to work out whether they're eligible to participate, and this occurs before the auction takes place. A penalty, conversely, is something which is some kind of a sanction or some punitive measure which occurs after the auction to encourage and to incentivize people to proceed with projects that have won in an auction. As we've seen and discussed earlier in the series, realisation rates for auctions are often lower than people hoped, and the effectiveness of auctions hinges on this point about people actually winning contracts and then taking those contracts forward and producing the projects that they've won a contract for. I think both of these things are intended to influence how participants develop their projects, so how ready they are to actually take part in the project, as some kind of measure of the quality of the project, but also it influences people's bidding behaviour. We're looking to encourage people to bid honestly, that is, not bidding below their costs, and to be as honest as possible, and to make it as a straightforward process as possible. But as I've just mentioned, the effects of both of these design elements are highly context specific, and we'll discuss some of that context in the case studies in a few moments' time. And generalisation about how to actually design these elements is quite difficult. So let's have a quick look at what they're for. There are a range of objectives that you might want to use for both of these. This is probably non-exhaustive. These are just some of the things that you might want to be achieving with these 2 particular design elements. The first is to ensure that bids are serious bids, that these people who are bringing projects to the table to take part in an auction actually have an intention to bring that project to fruition at some point in the future. The second is to prevent certain types of strategic behaviour. There are instances out there where people may, just as one example of strategic behaviour, bid particularly low in order to exclude a competitor from the bidding process. There are other examples of strategic behaviour. I think they were discussed earlier in the webinar series. And then, of course, there's always a risk for an auctioneer of handing out contracts or support to projects which ultimately fail. They're either not ready or for some unforeseen reason which wasn't tested during the auction process, that project fails and realisation rates are lower than were hoped for. And at the same time, want to encourage people to prevent late or non-delivery of their projects. Delays have been a key feature in many of the examples that we've seen out there, and actually bringing forward projects in a timely manner after an auction is often a key objective for policymakers. And of course, at the same time, we want to ensure that the projects that come through and bid and ultimately win auctions are the best quality projects. That is, that they not only exist and connect to the grid, but then they're able to perform as well. They produce as much electricity as everybody expected, and they're good projects. And I think the point I'm making with this slide is that both of these two design elements interact quite strongly, and nearly all of these objectives can be met or are influenced by these two design elements. Okay, so let's take a look at pre-qualification criteria. I've put at the top here that another way of thinking about these are hurdles to entry. This is a normalization process in some ways, which tries to get all of the projects to a similar status of development ahead of the auction. And in this context, it's used to test whether the bids are ready to participate in the auction, and for a number of reasons, to check whether they're going to actually be able to come forward, but also to check whether the risk profile is appropriate to take part in the auction. And an interesting angle is that these pre-qualification criteria, and we'll see examples of both in a moment, can be placed either on the project, that is, there may be some particular criteria for bringing a project into the program, or they may be on the developer, that is, the developer may have to have some particular quality or meet some particular standards in order to participate. Pre-qualification criteria can be binary, that's you either meet the criteria and you're in the auction program, or you don't and you're out. They could also be part of a multi-criteria assessment in which you need how well you meet the criteria is some assessment of how well you do in the auction process. I think we're going to focus primarily on the first kind, although we should bear in mind that there is a strong interaction between these two as we go through. And I think pre-qualification criteria, it's worth mentioning with this design element that there is always a balance between making sure that the bids are serious, that you achieve your policy objectives without damaging some of the other objectives, which may be to encourage smaller players or new entrants. The harder you make it to take part in the auction, obviously, it logically follows that you may exclude some people. So there's a careful balance being made there. And that is very context specific to the markets, the technologies, and the bidders. And as a final point, rules which permit or exclude people from taking part in projects from taking part in an auction may well be used to pursue other goals than auction effectiveness. And we'll touch on that briefly. I don't think this is the right place to talk about it in depth, but it's an interesting subject. And I think probably the classic example can be thought of as local content requirements. But I think that's a discussion for another time. We will touch on it as we go through, but I think it's something worth bearing in mind. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that there are some options for pre-qualification criteria, but the first one of these is whether a criterion applies to the project or whether it applies to the promoter, the developer of that project. So what we're really looking for on the project side is whether that project is feasible, whether it's the right project to take part in this auction, whether it's going to result in a good electricity generating project at the end. So there are various things. The first might be the technology choice. Often auctioneers require that a particular technology has been demonstrated before. For example, new and novel technologies, first of all, aren't going to do very well often in auctions, but secondly, they provide an element of uncontrolled risk, which may influence auction outcomes. Secondly, it's often required that an adequate supply chain plan is in place. So that's the suppliers are in place to provide the technology. Once the auction is finished, the developers are able to proceed and procure all of the plant needed to finish the project. The second point is whether you have access to the relevant land, which could be, in the case of solar, it could be a field, or it could, in a case of offshore wind, it could be relevant access to the seabed. Whatever it is, I think it's often a requirement for many auction procedures to ensure that you have land tenure before you proceed. The final one is, the second final one is the social environmental permitting side of things. It's often the case that one of the great uncertainties about renewable energy projects is whether or not it's actually going to be permitted, whether it's going to get planning permission, whether it's going to be able to pass all of those regulatory hurdles it needs to pass before it can proceed. And various auctions have various levels of criteria on whether these are met before you take part in the auction, to try and take some of that risk out to ensure that projects come forward once they've won the auction. And the final one is a similar but different issue around grid access. And that asks us to look at whether a project has access to grid to export electricity at the end. And these can vary all the way from having a proof of concept that the grid connection is technically viable, all the way through to a legally binding contract to supply a grid by a particular date, depending on the context. The second group of criteria may be placed on the developer, and some of these include financial competence of the developer. Is this developer financially strong enough to go forward with this project should they win the contract, should they win the auction? You can test these in varying ways. Some of the tests include a credit rating from some credit rating agencies. Others include a measure of the equity ratio, the gearing of the particular developer, to get an idea of whether they're a good financial bet to bring forward the project once they've won an auction. The other group of criteria relating to developers are the technical criteria around their experience. Have they done this before? Are there members of the team who are experienced enough to bring this project forward? Are there evidence of similar projects which have been developed and they're operating? So they're the two different groups of pre-qualification criteria. Penalties, on the other hand, I think it's interesting and useful to look at them as actually applying some kind of downside for under-delivery, so that should a project win an auction, there is some kind of additional incentive to proceed with their project in a timely manner, which is really important. Often it may be that project is perfectly happy to drag their feet, and from their rational point of view, that's what they would choose to do in the absence of a penalty. And in those circumstances, penalties may well help bring projects forward and improve auction effectiveness. A lot of the evidence out there that we've seen from previous auctions suggests that auction realisation rates are generally poorer if penalties aren't in place. And often it's discussed in terms of what level to set the penalties and whether, rather than whether a penalty ought to be implemented. As a note of caution around penalties, I think it's worth discussing the fact that if you apply a penalty in whatever form, it adds some risk and some cost to that developer that they have to price in. So if there's a particularly harsh penalty for non-delivery, you can expect the bids that come forward will in some way reflect that in their bid prices. At least you would hope so if they're rational bidders. The other caution is probably to point out that penalties on their own aren't going to guarantee that projects get built. You can't use, as I think the easiest way to look at it is to say that penalties or other punitive measures can't be used to encourage people to lose money. If the project has come through and it simply isn't going to make money on the price that they've bid, a penalty won't encourage them to do it. However, the fact that the penalty's there will hopefully encourage their bidding behaviour to reflect their costs more accurately if they have that information available. So penalties need to be credible. You have to, the project developers coming into this process have to believe that if they are in default and non-delivery or later delivery after they win an auction, they are going to be sanctioned in some way. That has to be a credible threat, and they have to be proportionate to prevent excluding smaller actors. But setting these is very context specific and very difficult, and as far as we can work out, there are no hard and fast rules about what proportion or what monetary value the penalties ought to be in a particular context, and it's often a process of trial and error on behalf of policymakers. as I just alluded to, very high penalties do risk excluding small actors. For example, a very big bond, which is large enough to make the very big players, the biggest players, take project delivery seriously, may be too big to actually enable smaller ones to raise the relevant finance to fund the bond. So I think that's an interesting point, and one that we have to consider in a very similar way to we do with pre-qualification criteria. And of course, as a final point, it's really important for any penalty system to make sure that developers aren't sanctioned for things which are outside of their control. For example, if it's a grid connection problem, which is entirely the responsibility of the TSO or the distribution owner, it's inappropriate, unfair, and unhelpful if the developer is sanctioned for a delay resulting from someone else's responsibility. So we have to differentiate between reasons for delay that are the developer's responsibility and reasons which are outside of their control. So there are a range of policy choices to be made to decide what the penalties should be. We need to decide what form the penalties ought to take. They could be purely financial, which is often the case. There is often a bond which needs to be raised before the auction takes place, or a cash deposit, which is a similar technique, which may not be returned in default. For example, if you don't deliver your project or you don't sign your contract, whichever you're looking to achieve, that bond or that deposit is then withdrawn, and you lose that, and that's a substantial financial loss. It could be that you're excluded from future rounds. So we've seen in the UK the approach to penalties for their CFD auction last year was simply to exclude projects from participating for a period of 1 year. It could be that the financial penalty actually affects the level of support on offer by the auctioneer. So it could be that if you win an auction at price X, that price X is reduced either incrementally or to a fixed point at the point of default. So that could be the penalty. Or it could just be that you forfeit your right to hold the contract entirely, and that your bid is rejected after the auction if you don't bring your project forward. So the point at which the penalty comes into effect is important. It could simply be that as at the auction close, the bid is returned to you or not to ensure that you participate, or it could be that you're looking to sign a contract of some kind. And if you're unable to sign that contract, so if you win at a price that you're unable to proceed at, and you're unable to sign the contract, then you lose your bond or whatever the penalty is comes into effect. The other point is the trigger for the penalty. It could be that there's a particular delivery deadline, and very often auctions have a range between 2 and 5 years within which you need to deliver your project, and if you hit that deadline, you haven't delivered your project, then the penalty kicks in. It could be that there are project milestones. You need to have reached a certain stage of development by a particular date, in which case the penalty or part of the penalty kicks in. Or it could be that poor production is the item that we're trying to incentivize, so that low production has some kind of penalty associated with it. And in some cases, that may even hold a bond over until the very end of the project's life, which could be 15 years. The basis of the penalty can be calculated in any number of ways. It could be a fixed value, or it could be a proportion of the project cost, it could be a proportion of the lifetime revenues. There are a range of options there. And as I said earlier, the exact monetary value of the penalty is extremely hard to give any general guidance on, simply because it's so specific to the type of actor and the type of market sector we're looking at. And of course, the penalty may not be pulled all in one go, so it may be that a small deviation, so a small delay, results in a proportionately smaller penalty than a larger one. I think an important point here, and we've touched on it a few times, is the interaction between these two design elements. So pre-qualification criteria and penalties are similar but differentiated design elements. And I think a really clear example of that is if you make pre-qualification very difficult, for example, and you don't have any penalties in place, you create a situation where bidders have even greater sunk costs than they would have done otherwise because they've had to invest a lot to meet particular permitting requirements or to take out particular expensive surveys or to invest in grid studies in order to participate. In the absence of penalties, in that circumstance, it may be very hard for them to bid rationally, and they may be tempted to bid lower than they would do otherwise. And then we have a problem of whether they can bring the project forward. So I think that the two do go very closely hand in hand, and it's impossible to think about one without consideration of the other. So we'll talk about a few international examples now. These case studies are largely drawn from some of the earlier and ongoing AURES work, which is being led by Ecofis. So if you're interested in any of these, I'd return to the AURES website. There are some links at the end, but there are some detailed case studies on particular auction implementations. And these are some of the information that's picked out of those to illustrate some of these design element points. But if you want a good general overview, that works there, as is the earlier webinar, which I think was the week before last. So often discussed is the case of Brazil when it comes to renewable energy auctions. It's been their mode of procurement of renewables as well as other generation for a long time. The most interesting one on an international scale is the wind and solar participation in auctions from back to 2007 onwards. So pre-qualification in Brazil is fairly standard. There's an environmental permitting and requirement. There's a certification on the equipment itself required, and grid connection approval. One of the interesting factors in Brazil is in order to ensure that bidders are bringing forward projects that they really understand the resource of, and they're able to make those rational decisions about what level to bid at, there's a resource assessment based on on-site measurements, I think, for 2 years. And this has been made tougher since 2013. I think in the earlier implementations of this policy, some of the projects were able to bring forward their P50 estimate of their production. And I think this has been made tougher in 2013, which shows that not only are policymakers learning, but they're learning about pre-qualification and how that impacts some of the outcomes. So the penalties are based on some various construction milestones. The contract price reduces by some factor in line with the amount of delay. And if the delay is over a certain length of time, in this case a year, the regulator who's administrating the auction, effectively the auctioneer, is able to keep the bond. The bid bond represents 1% of the investment value, which is triggered if you don't sign the contract on winning an auction, and if you don't deliver that project, you lose a further 5%. I think one of the things we've seen in Brazil, though, is because many of the reasons for delay, notably I think grid has been a big one, are outside the control of developers. There's some ambiguity about whether these penalties are actually as harsh as they seem, and there are lots of cases where they have actually been waived for various reasons. I think the important thing to take away, though, from Brazil is the fact that it's notable that the realisation rates after 2013 and the pre-qualification was made tougher seem to be somewhat better. So I think we can see a clear indication that the pre-qualification design element was important in determining the effectiveness of the auction in the Brazilian case. In France, where it was a very different market, we're looking at small-scale solar PV, generally on rooftops. The pre-qualification criteria were not entirely different. We're looking at making sure you have control of the site, in this case, owning the roof on which the PV panel is going to be installed. Some evidence of the developer's financial capacity to bring it forward, and relevant building permits. I think an interesting one, perhaps that discussion we were mentioning earlier about bringing forward other policy goals through this design element, is around the CO2 footprint assessment, which not only did you have to have the footprint assessment carried out, but you also had to be able to, that assessment was used as one of the criteria for allocating winners. Without discussing that too much, I think it's clear that the context in France is fairly different from other places, simply because we were looking at very small scale bidders. So small developers, small projects, and the criteria, although they don't appear very much more complex than the Brazilian instance, the bidders tend to be smaller and the criteria may well have been too complex. And there was some concern about reduced participation at the pre-qualification stage, leading to a lack of competition in the auction, higher prices, which may have been of some concern for policymakers. Penalties-wise, in France, if the project wasn't generating within the required period, I believe it was 18 months, for every month delay, there was a 2-month reduction in the amount of support available. So it's a financial penalty, but it's a rather softer financial penalty than a bond. And the period is extendable if there's a delay for reasons outside of the bidder's control. I think the low realisation rates, though, may imply that the penalties weren't entirely appropriate to the market segment. Perhaps the penalties weren't clearly communicated enough, or perhaps they weren't harsh enough. But there were fairly low realisation rates, and I think that may tell us something about designing penalties that are suitable for the market segment. So an entirely different case from both of the first two is Denmark. So the pre-qualification hurdles are very significant for the Danish offshore wind projects, particularly the single standalone single site tenders that we've seen 5 of in Denmark since 2004. So not only do you have to show that you're able to do this, you have to show that you've done it before, you have to be able to show that you've built an offshore wind park before and you've operated it, with up to 5 examples of development and construction. You have to have a minimum level of turnover, so that's explicitly excluding small firms from participating, and the financial health, you have to have a certain level of credit rating or a certain limit on your equity ratio. And at the same time, there were certain criteria on the project itself, which is pursuing another social goal outside of the goals of auction effectiveness, which was the number of trainee positions created in the construction of the project. I think it's interesting to look at this in contrast to France, because the pre-qualification criteria are extremely tough. But because of the context, we're talking about extremely big and difficult projects to construct here. Offshore wind, although in the last auction for Hornsrev 3, there may have only been 4 bidders, but there may have only been 4 competent developers out there at that particular moment willing to take part. So it's entirely dependent on the context. That competition seems to have come forward. The prices for the last auction were extremely good. I believe that the Danish government are extremely pleased with them, and these very stringent pre-qualification criteria were entirely appropriate in that context. And the penalties are large financial penalties for delays in construction and delays in beginning construction and delays in completing construction. I think the interesting point for penalties in the Danish case is there does appear to be an improvement in participation due to a relaxation in penalties between the Anholt tender, which 2011, which didn't deliver the result that was looking forward, only a single bidder coming forward and quite a high price as a result. Perhaps one of the contributing factors behind that low participation in that Anholt tender could have been the particularly tough penalty. So the overall cash implications were reduced by about 50% between that and the most recent one, bringing forward more bidders, bringing forward competition, and therefore lower prices, lower support costs. and lower social costs for building that wind park. And finally, it's the case of California. So pre-qualification in California, which is in their renewable auction mechanism program, a series of 6 auctions which ran between 2009 and last year, were quite interesting. They were quite tough. At least one member of the team had to have completed a similar project, which I think is quite important because you're excluding new entrants from explicitly in that instance. As is quite common, they're excluding innovative and new technologies by saying that at least 2 operating examples of that technology must exist somewhere in the world, and varying levels of grid connection viability. Actually, for the first 4 auctions that they ran, grid connection had to be proved to be viable with a study done by the relevant grid operator. Finally, for the last 2, the developers had to have a binding grid offer. I think the interesting thing in California about the pre-qualification, which seemed quite harsh, because we were talking in this instance about projects between 3 and 20 megawatts, so not entirely, not all very, very big projects. But in California, first of all, they were used to developing in the Californian context, and the auctioneers were the same people with whom you would normally have a PPA anyway. But also there was a huge volume of projects available to choose from. So the RAM program was actually a relatively small slice of a very big market. So they could afford to exclude lots of developers and lots of projects. And their intention here was to explicitly bring them forward fast. So they just wanted to make sure they had the best quality projects, which led them to implement penalties which were quite stringent for projects that didn't deliver between the strict 2-year delivery window. So there was a development deposit and a performance deposit. So they wanted you to not only bring forward the project within 2 years, although there was a 6-month grace for some administrative delays, generally around grid, but they also wanted to make sure that they held something back to make sure that you produced electricity, which is a curious example, I think, because you would assume that a developer, once they've built a project, are looking to get their return as they can. But it appears that in California, a belt and braces approach to ensuring project performance was taken. Okay, so there are 4 case studies I wanted to look at, and I'm going to talk very briefly about the conclusions we can draw from that. Don't expect anything too profound, I'm afraid. As I said earlier, drawing general lessons from these design elements is very tough, but I'll talk very, very briefly about it, and then perhaps I'll invite some questions from you guys who are listening. Okay, so I think the obvious point I'd like to make is that pre-qualification criteria and penalties both impact auction outcomes. We've seen in all of the case study examples that you can draw some connection between how the pre-qualification criteria and the penalties were designed and how they interacted in whether the project came forward, how they and whether they were actually completed. And the other common point is that they're both a tough balance to make, a balance that brings forward projects but doesn't exclude the smaller or less experienced actors. I think that will be one of the interesting points that's made in next week's webinar, if you want to come back to that, looking particularly at actor diversity. And penalties and pre-qualification criteria can both be a drag on actor diversity, which is often a key policy objective for renewable energy policy. And I think the overarching point is that, that I've made several times now, is that it's so highly context specific that no auctions will have the same problems that they're trying to solve with these 2 design elements, and therefore there will be no 2 auction programs that have the same remedies for those problems. It's very much a case of trying to understand the bidders, trying to understand the technology context, and trying to understand the institutional context to a certain degree. It's certainly in the Californian case, one of the reasons I feel that people could, that the policymakers could have quite stringent criteria is because people were comfortable interacting with the utilities that were actually running the project, the auction program. That may not be the case in all instances, So I think that the context, the markets and the technologies are really important and can't be overstated. So that's all I wanted to talk about really. If you want to download this presentation afterwards, feel free. There's some further reading to take a look at. The design elements report, which came out last year, contains all of the information that's in here, and probably in quite a lot more detail. That's extremely useful, and ongoing are the production of these case studies I referred to. There are hyperlinks here for the Californian one and the Danish one, but the others will come forward over the course of the next few months. That's it from me. I'll see if there are any questions coming forward, and if there are, I shall answer them. Now, either I'm not using the software correctly. Okay. So I've opened a Q&A if you would like to send questions that way, but there don't appear to be any coming forward. Okay, I've got a question here. Is there a rule of thumb on the level of penalties? For example, should they be twice as high if the project has not got permits yet? I think that's a really interesting question, and it sort of goes to the heart of my overarching point in that, no, the rules of thumb for penalties are very hard to define. For example, in one instance, it may be exactly that case. It may be appropriate that if a project hasn't got its permits, or you're not expecting them to have your permits because you haven't required them, that you're going to have twice the penalties. That could be appropriate, but in another context, with a different technology, for example, a technology for which obtaining permits is far easier, the case could be that actually obtaining a permit doesn't require you to increase the penalty at all, which actually introduces this level of context-specific design, for which it's really difficult to make generalizations and rules of thumb. I hope that answers that question. Okay, so I don't think any other questions are going to come forward, so that's fine. If anybody does have any questions that suddenly occur to them later on, my email address is on the presentation. The presentation, I think, later on today will be made available for download along with a recording of the webinar. So if there's anything else you want to know, get in touch with me or download the presentation, and keep looking at the AURES website because there will be more and more information on there throughout this year. That's great. Thanks very much.